This isn't a story I tell at dinner parties. This is something that lives in the quiet corners of my memory, a reminder of how quickly love can curdle into something else entirely. It's all true, every last word of it. The champagne flute felt impossibly heavy in my father's hand, the crystal catching the light from the grand chandelier of the Plaza Hotel's ballroom. He stood before 200 of New York's elite, all gathered for my 25th birthday, and in the first line of his toast, he shattered my world. To my daughter, Amelia, he began, his voice booming with false affection, she has her mother's heart and, thankfully, her mother's spending habits. Lord knows she could never handle a single dollar of the family business. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The laughter was polite but immediate, a wave of condescending chuckles that washed over me, hot and suffocating. I stood beside him, trapped in a Vera Wang gown that suddenly felt like a costume, a forced smile plastered on my face. My father, Richard Hayes, the real estate magnate, had a particular talent for the public compliment that was, in private, a devastating insult. He'd done it my whole life. He called it, keeping me humble. I called it cruelty. He placed the flute back on a passing waiter's tray and wrapped an arm around my shoulders, squeezing me in a proprietary way. "Happy birthday, darling," he whispered, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and victory. Victory over what? I wasn't sure. Me, perhaps. He saw me as his finest, most frivolous creation, an accessory to his legacy, not an heir to it. For years, I had accepted this role. I'd studied art history at Columbia, just as he'd suggested. I'd chaired the charity galas he'd pointed me toward. I'd lived in the Upper East Side apartment he'd bought for me. I played the part of the dutiful, slightly ditzy daughter because it was easier than fighting the tide. But standing there, under the weight of 200 pairs of eyes and the crushing gravity of his casual dismissal, something inside me didn't just break, it hardened. The seed of rebellion, long dormant, began to stir. That night, I went home not to my pristine apartment, but to my mother's old brownstone in Greenwich Village, a place he hadn't touched since she died. It was the one asset solely in my name, a relic he couldn't control. I let myself in, the air thick with the scent of old books and dried lavender. In her study, I found what I was looking for, boxes of her old financial records. My mother, for all her quiet grace, had been meticulous. I spent the entire night, and then the next 3 days, fueled by coffee and a cold, simmering rage, piecing together the architecture of my gilded cage. I discovered the truth about the Amelia Hayes Trust, the fund my father had established for me upon my mother's passing. He'd always spoken of it with a paternalistic pride, a safety net for his financially inept daughter. The paperwork told a different story. The trust held a significant block of shares, 10%, in Hayes Legacy Homes, my father's publicly traded company. But a clause, buried deep in the legalese, gave him sole, absolute voting rights over those shares until my 35th birthday. He had a decade of unquestioned control. Worse, as I cross-referenced the trust statements with the company's public filings, a pattern of calculated malpractice emerged. He had been using the trust as his personal slush fund. He would leverage its assets to secure financing for his own high-risk, private side ventures. If they paid off, the profits went directly into his personal accounts. If they failed, the trust absorbed the loss. He wasn't just managing my inheritance, he was gutting it, all while telling me I was too stupid to balance a checkbook. The betrayal was a physical ache in my chest. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the lie I had been living. My entire identity as his cherished, protected daughter was a fabrication designed to keep me docile and ignorant while he plundered my birthright. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I took a taxi to the Hayes Legacy Homes headquarters on Park Avenue. The building was a monument to my father's ego, a sleek, imposing tower of glass and steel that scraped the Manhattan sky. His office was on the top floor, a palatial space with panoramic views of Central Park. I found him in a meeting with his chief financial officer, a perpetually nervous man named George, and his lead counsel, a shark in a Brioni suit named Marcus Thorne. They all looked up in surprise as I walked in, unannounced. I placed a file on the polished mahogany desk. It contained the trust statements, highlighted and annotated. "I have some questions about my trust," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. My father glanced at the file, then at me, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes before it was replaced by his customary condescending amusement. "Amelia, darling, what is this? Did you get a B in a community college accounting class and now you think you're a wolf of Wall Street?" he chuckled. Marcus and George followed his lead, smiling sycophantically. "I'm serious, Dad," I said, holding my ground. "I want to know why the trust's capital was used to back a failed mining speculation in Nevada. And a tech startup that went bankrupt last year. These ventures aren't part of Hayes Legacy Homes. They trace back to your private holding companies." The smile vanished from my father's face. Marcus Thorne stepped forward, picking up the file as if it were contaminated. "Ms. Hayes," he began, his voice smooth as silk and just as suffocating, "the management of your trust is entirely at the discretion of the trustee, as per the document you signed when you were 18. Your father has acted in what he believes to be your best long-term interest. I'm afraid you fundamentally misunderstood these complex financial instruments. I understand that my inheritance is being gambled away to cover your personal losses," I shot back, looking directly at my father. He stood up, his 6'3" frame towering over me. The affable patriarch was gone, replaced by the ruthless CEO. "That is enough," he said, his voice a low growl. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You are an art historian. You are out of your depth, and you are embarrassing yourself and me." He turned to Marcus. "Show my daughter out. And schedule a meeting with her financial advisor. We may need to simplify her allowance." The dismissal was absolute. I was a child being sent to my room. As I was escorted out, passing the sea of desks where analysts and executives managed a multi-billion-dollar empire, I felt a fresh wave of humiliation. He wasn't just a bad father, he was a corporate predator, and I was his easiest prey. But as the elevator descended, that humiliation burned away, leaving behind something cold and hard. He thought I was an idiot. He thought I was a frivolous child playing dress-up. He had built an empire on the foundation of my mother's money, and now he was using my own inheritance to prop it up. As I stepped out onto the rain-slicked pavement of Park Avenue, I looked back up at the tower. He was untouchable up there, surrounded by lawyers and yes-men, insulated by wealth and power. An ordinary lawsuit would be tied up in court for years, drained by his legal team until I had nothing left. He had left me no conventional path to justice. So, I would have to forge my own. The war wouldn't be fought in a courtroom. It would be fought in the stock market. He said I could never handle the family business. I decided then and there that I would take it from him. The first step was to understand the battlefield. I sold a Degas sketch my mother had left me, one that had hung in my apartment, and used the proceeds to hire not a lawyer, but a forensic accountant. His name was Ben Carter, a quiet, unassuming man in his late 40s who worked out of a cramped office in the financial district. He was exactly the kind of person my father would overlook. More importantly, he had a history with Hayes Legacy Homes. My father had fired him a decade earlier for being, in his words, pathologically risk-averse. Ben's caution was exactly what I needed. For 2 weeks, Ben lived in my mother's study, surrounded by boxes of files and fueled by takeout coffee. He didn't just confirm my suspicions, he unearthed a level of duplicity that stunned me. My father had created a labyrinth of shell corporations and offshore accounts. He was using the company, and my trust, as his personal piggy bank, inflating costs on construction projects, siphoning off the excess, and hiding it all in plain sight through complex, perfectly legal maneuvers. "He's brilliant, I'll give him that," Ben said one night, rubbing his tired eyes as he pointed to a flowchart he'd drawn that looked like a spider's web. "He stays just inside the legal lines. Suing him would be a nightmare. He'd bury you in discovery and bleed you dry. But," he paused, a thoughtful look on his face, "his arrogance is a liability. He doesn't believe anyone is smart enough to catch him, let alone challenge him. Ben then pulled up the corporate structure of Hayes Legacy Homes on his laptop. It was publicly traded on the NYSE. Here's the breakdown, he explained. The total number of outstanding shares is 100 million. Your father personally owns 30 million shares, or 30%. Your trust holds 10 million, or 10%. His sister, your Aunt Caroline, holds 5 million, or 5%. That's a 45% controlling block for the Hayes family. The other 55% is public float, owned by mutual funds, pension plans, and individual investors. My heart sank. So he's untouchable. He controls the family vote. He controls your vote, Ben corrected gently. And he relies on Caroline's loyalty. But his personal 30% isn't a majority. He's only invincible as long as the family block holds together and the institutional investors are happy. A new plan began to form in my mind, audacious and terrifying. What if the institutional investors weren't happy? I asked. Ben's eyes lit up with a flicker of understanding. They're not thrilled right now, he admitted. Your father's latest project, the Atlantic Gateway development in Red Hook, Brooklyn, is a massive gamble. He paid top dollar for the land, and the city council is pushing back hard on his zoning requests. The project is leveraged to the hilt. The stock has dipped 8% in the last quarter because of it. Some of the big funds are getting nervous. That was my opening. I had one major asset my father couldn't touch, my mother's brownstone in the village. It was prime real estate, valued at over $12 million. I also had her jewelry and a small art collection she had kept separate from the main family holdings. It was a painful thought, liquidating the last tangible pieces of her, but it was a necessary sacrifice. My resolve hardened. I would trade my mother's legacy to reclaim it. We devised a strategy. I would sell everything and use the capital to begin acquiring shares of Hayes Legacy Homes on the open market. But it had to be done in absolute secrecy. If my father caught even a whiff of a large buyer accumulating stock, he would drive the price up or take defensive measures. Ben set up a series of anonymous LLCs, registered in Delaware, each with a different innocuous name: Bedford Capital, Grove Street Ventures, Minetta Partners. Each LLC would purchase small, insignificant blocks of shares through different brokers, never enough to trigger SEC disclosure requirements. It was a slow, methodical process, a financial war of attrition. I moved out of the brownstone and into a small, rented studio in Murray Hill. I sold my designer clothes on the RealReal. I traded my Uber Black account for a MetroCard. Every dollar went into the war chest. My friends from my old life called, wondering why I'd dropped off the face of the earth. I made excuses, a personal project, a need for space. They couldn't understand. How could I explain that the girl they knew, the one who planned charity galas and debated the merits of Impressionism, was now spending 18 hours a day studying market trends and SEC filings? The transformation was isolating but empowering. For the first time in my life, I felt a sense of purpose that was entirely my own. My father, meanwhile, remained blissfully ignorant. We spoke occasionally on the phone. His tone was smugly paternal. "How's your little budget going, darling?" he'd ask. "Learning the value of a dollar yet?" "Slowly but surely," I'd reply, gritting my teeth as I watched the ticker for HLG, his company's stock symbol, flash on my computer screen. After 6 months of painstaking acquisitions, we had accumulated 3.5 million shares, or 3.5% of the company. It had cost me nearly everything I had. Added to my trust's 10%, I now controlled 13.5%. It was a start, but it wasn't nearly enough. I needed an ally from within the family. I needed Aunt Caroline. My Aunt Caroline was my mother's younger sister, a retired classics professor who lived a quiet life in Boston. She and my father had always maintained a cordial but distant relationship. She found him brash and arrogant, he found her intellectually intimidating and irrelevant. She held 5% of the company, an inheritance from my grandfather that my father had never been able to wrestle from her. He managed her portfolio, sending her a generous dividend check every quarter, and she, in turn, never attended a board meeting or asked a single question. She had trusted him. I took the Acela up to Boston on a crisp autumn day. I found her in her Beacon Hill apartment, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the comforting smell of old paper. She looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years. "Amelia," she said, her sharp blue eyes missing nothing. "You look different. Tired, but focused." Over tea, I laid it all out. I didn't begin with the stock purchases. I began with the betrayal. I showed her the statements from my trust, the same evidence I had presented to my father. I walked her through the labyrinth of his private ventures, showing her how he had gambled with my inheritance. Her face, initially etched with skepticism, slowly hardened into a mask of cold fury. When I was finished, she was silent for a long time, staring out the window at the brick-lined street. "He always saw your mother's money, my father's money, as his own," she said softly. "He married into this legacy, he didn't build it. He just inflated it with debt and ego." She then walked over to a filing cabinet and pulled out a stack of her own financial statements. "I never looked too closely," she confessed. "Richard could be so charmingly dismissive, it was always easier to just let him handle it." We spent the next hour comparing her portfolio's performance to the general market. The story was the same as mine: chronic underperformance, suspicious fees, and a structure that gave my father far too much control. He hadn't been as reckless with her money as he had been with mine, but he had been systematically siphoning off value for years. "That arrogant son of a bitch," she whispered, the words sharp and venomous. "He lectured me about fiscal prudence at Christmas dinner last year." That's when I told her about my plan. I told her about the anonymous LLCs, the shares I had already acquired, and my ultimate goal. I wasn't asking for her money. I was asking for her proxy. For her vote. I needed her 5%. She looked at me, a long, appraising stare. The woman my father had dismissed as a bookish spinster had eyes like chips of ice. "Taking on your father is like wrestling with a crocodile, Amelia. He will play dirty, and he will show no mercy, especially to you." "I know," I said. "But he's over-leveraged on the Red Hook project. The press is starting to turn against it, the community boards are in revolt. The stock is weak. He's vulnerable, for the first time in his life. He thinks I'm in Europe spending my allowance. He won't see me coming." I slid a document across the table. A proxy agreement, drafted by Ben. It would assign the voting rights for her 5 million shares to me. It was everything. She picked up a pen, its weight seeming to settle the matter in her mind. "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become," she said, and with a firm, steady hand, she signed her name. The moment the ink dried, the balance of power shifted. With my trust's 10%, her 5%, and my secret 3.5%, I now controlled 18.5% of the company. It was still a far cry from a majority, but it was a beachhead. A real, tangible threat. My father's 30% no longer looked so insurmountable. The war had officially begun. The next phase was the most dangerous. Ben and I calculated that we needed to acquire at least another 7.5 million shares to have a shot at a controlling interest when combined with our family block. That would bring us to 26%. Not quite a majority of the company, but a majority of the voting shares at any given meeting, assuming average shareholder attendance. The problem was money. I was tapped out. We needed more capital, and we needed to escalate our buying without alerting my father. The answer, ironically, came from his own arrogance. The Atlantic Gateway project in Red Hook was becoming a bigger and bigger disaster. Costs were spiraling, and a major union dispute had halted construction. My father, in a display of pure hubris, doubled down. He announced a secondary stock offering, issuing new shares to raise capital to pour into the failing project. His logic was that the temporary dip in stock price was a buying opportunity for the company to fund its visionary future. The big institutional investors saw it for what it was, throwing good money after bad. They started to unload their positions, quietly at first, then in larger blocks. The stock price began to slide from $35 a share down to $28. My father was furious, publicly blaming short-sighted Wall Street cowards in an interview with the Wall Street Journal. For us, it was a godsend. A lower stock price meant our capital went further. And the institutional sellers provided the liquidity we needed to buy shares without driving the price back up. Ben found our savior in the form of a small, activist hedge fund run by a woman named Sarah Jenkins. Sarah had a reputation for being a shark, but a principled one. She targeted bloated, poorly managed companies with arrogant CEOs. Hayes Legacy Homes, under my father's recent leadership, was a perfect target. I met her in a nondescript conference room in Midtown. I gave her the 30-minute version, backed by Ben's meticulous research. I showed her the corporate waste, the self-dealing, the over-leveraged gamble in Red Hook. I didn't tell her I was Richard Hayes' daughter. I presented myself as a concerned investor who had uncovered a massive vulnerability. Sarah listened intently, her face unreadable. When I finished, she leaned back. "This is good work. Your numbers are solid. But what's your angle? You don't look like the typical corporate raider." I took a breath. The current CEO is running this company into the ground with his ego. He's destroying shareholder value. I want him out. I have a voting block of 18.5%. I need a partner to get me over the finish line. You help me acquire the necessary shares, and when I take control, you'll have a friend in the CEO's office and your investment will double in value within a year under competent management. "Who is the new management?" she asked, her eyes narrowed. "Me," I said. For the first time, Sarah smiled. It was a thin, predatory smile. "I like your style," she said. "Let's burn it all down." The partnership with Sarah Jenkins' fund, Apex Capital, transformed the game. We were no longer nibbling at the edges, we were hunting. Apex provided the capital and the trading infrastructure. My LLCs, now funded by Apex, began absorbing the shares the panicked institutional funds were selling. We moved like ghosts in the market, spreading our purchases across dozens of small transactions, never showing our hand. My father, blinded by his battle with the Red Hook unions and the negative press, saw only a generalized market weakness. He never suspected a coordinated attack. He believed everyone else was a fool for not seeing his vision. By late spring, nearly a year after my disastrous birthday party, we had done it. Between my holdings, my aunt's proxy, and the shares acquired through Apex, our block controlled a staggering 28 million shares. 28%. My father still held his 30%, but we were now a formidable opposition. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place unexpectedly. George, my father's perpetually terrified CFO, reached out to me through a discreet back channel. We met at a dimly lit bar in the East Village. He was a wreck, chain-smoking and constantly looking over his shoulder. "He's going to cook the books," George whispered, his voice trembling. "The quarterly report is due next week, and the numbers from the Red Hook project are catastrophic. He's ordered me to capitalize expenses that should be on the P&L statement. It's blatant fraud. He's trying to hide the scale of the disaster until he can secure a new line of credit." George was terrified of going to prison, but he was more terrified of my father. He slid a thumb drive across the table. "This is the real data. The unaudited numbers. It's a bloodbath. If this gets out, the stock will crater, and the SEC will launch an investigation." He looked me in the eye, his face pale with sweat. "I heard rumors about a block of shares being accumulated. If you're planning a move, you have to do it now. Before he drags the entire company, and all of us, down with him." I had my weapon. The annual shareholders' meeting was scheduled for the following month, to be held in the main boardroom at Hayes Legacy Homes headquarters. It was time to call the vote. The days leading up to the meeting were the most intense of my life. Ben, Sarah, and I, along with a team of lawyers from Apex, worked out of a secure suite at the Mandarin Oriental, planning every detail. We drafted the motions, prepared the speeches, and wargamed my father's likely reactions. He would be furious, then dismissive, then threatening. We had to be prepared for all of it. On the morning of the meeting, I chose my armor carefully, a simple, severe navy blue dress. No jewelry, hair pulled back. I was not Amelia Hayes, the socialite. I was the architect of her father's demise. I walked into the boardroom and took a seat at the back, just another anonymous face among the junior executives and investor relations staff. Ben sat beside me, looking more nervous than I was. Aunt Caroline was there, seated near the front, a picture of calm, professorial dignity. My father was at the head of the table, in his element. He was laughing, shaking hands, oozing the charisma that had built his empire. He looked invincible. He didn't even notice me walk in. The meeting began with his address. It was a masterclass in corporate spin. He painted the Red Hook disaster as a temporary setback, a testament to the company's bold vision. He spoke of legacy, of building for the future, of weathering the storms of short-sighted critics. He was charming, persuasive, and utterly dishonest. Then came the formal business. The first item on the agenda was the re-election of the existing board of directors, a slate of his hand-picked cronies. All those in favor, he asked, expecting the usual rubber stamp approval. Aunt Caroline raised her hand. "Mr. Chairman," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the room. "I'd like to propose an alternative slate of directors." My father stared at her, stunned. "Caroline? What is the meaning of this? Furthermore," she continued, ignoring him, "I have assigned my voting proxy for this meeting to another shareholder." A murmur went through the room. My father's face was turning a dangerous shade of red. "This is absurd," he blustered. "Who? To whom did you assign your proxy?" That was my cue. I stood up from the back of the room. All eyes turned to me. The confusion on my father's face as he saw me was a picture I will treasure for the rest of my life. It was a slow-motion cascade of emotions, surprise, then annoyance, then dawning, horrified comprehension. "To me, Dad," I said, my voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even myself. I walked slowly to the front of the room, my heels clicking on the marble floor. I placed a stack of documents on the polished table in front of him. "I am also the designated representative for Bedford Capital, Grove Street Ventures, Minetta Partners, and a dozen other LLCs who have a vested interest in the future of this company. And I am exercising the voting rights for the Amelia Hayes Trust." The corporate secretary and Marcus Thorne, the lawyer, scrambled to look at the documents. Their faces went pale. The math was undeniable. "I believe we have the votes to elect a new board," I continued, my voice cold and even. "And our first order of business will be a motion of no confidence in the current CEO." The room erupted. My father slammed his fist on the table. "This is a joke. A hostile takeover. By my own daughter. You have no idea how to run this company. You can't even balance your own allowance," he roared, the facade of the civilized chairman stripped away to reveal the raging bully beneath. "You're right," I said, meeting his furious gaze without flinching. "I don't know how to run a company that uses shareholder money to cover personal gambling debts. I don't know how to commit securities fraud to hide my own failures." I looked over at George, the CFO, who was sweating profusely. "George, would you care to share the real, unaudited numbers from the Red Hook project with the board?" George looked at my father, then at me, and his fear of prison finally outweighed his fear of his boss. He nodded meekly. The fight went out of my father's eyes. He knew he was beaten. He looked at me, this daughter he had underestimated, belittled, and dismissed his entire life. He wasn't looking at his little girl. He was looking at the woman who had just taken everything from him. The vote was a formality. His board was out. My new board was in. My first act as the new controlling power was to call for a vote. I moved to remove Richard Hayes as CEO and chairman of the board of Hayes Legacy Homes, effective immediately. It passed. He was escorted from the room by security, a broken, sputtering man, stripped of his power in the very boardroom that had been his throne. The silence he left behind was deafening. I stood at the head of the table, in his chair, and looked at the faces staring back at me. They were a mixture of shock, fear, and grudging respect. The war was over. I had won. Weeks later, the dust had begun to settle. The news of the hostile takeover by the spurned daughter was the talk of Wall Street, a salacious story for the business pages. The stock had initially tumbled, then rallied hard after I held a press conference, laid out the unvarnished truth about the Red Hook project, and announced a new, more realistic strategy for the company. I brought in Ben Carter as my new CFO and Sarah Jenkins took a seat on my new board. We began the arduous process of untangling the financial mess my father had created, selling off his vanity projects and refocusing on the company's core business of building high-quality residential properties. It was grueling, relentless work, but for the first time, I felt alive. I was in my father's old office, my office now. The panoramic view of Central Park was the same, but the energy was different. I had replaced his dark, heavy mahogany furniture with clean lines, light woods, and modern art. On the corner of the large glass desk sat a single-framed photograph that the cleaning crew had left behind. It was of him and me, taken at a company picnic years ago. I was about 7 years old, sitting on his shoulders, beaming with adoration for the man I thought was a king. He was smiling too, a proprietary smile of ownership. I picked up the frame, my fingers tracing the outline of my own younger, innocent face. I thought about his words, the ones that had echoed in my head my entire life, the ones that had been both a prison and, ultimately, a catalyst. Lord knows she could never handle a single dollar of the family business. I opened the drawer of my desk, took the photo out of its frame, and tore it neatly in half. The sound was quiet but final. I dropped the 2 pieces into the wastebasket. My father was gone, forced into a quiet, humiliating retirement in Florida, stripped of his title, his power, and the legacy he had stolen. I looked out at the city, a sprawling kingdom of glass and concrete, ambition and betrayal. He was right about one thing, I never could handle money the way he did. I was so much better at it. The end.